Welcome Year 8 to this cells revision lesson. The aim of this is to consolidate everything we've done on cells, diffusion, osmosis and active transport before we move on. Quite a few keywords there for you that we're going to be using today. You've got a copy of this slide in your notebook. You've got space to answer the do now questions. So pause the video, read through the information on the slide, answer the questions, and then press play again when you're ready to go through the answers. So here are the answers to the do now questions. So any two of these three for question 1, cell wall, chloroplast, vacuole. For number 2, the genetic materials in the nucleus. Number 3, chloroplast. Number 4, high to low concentration, and number 5, cell sap. So you could, if you've got any of these, if you've got them right, well done. If you've got them wrong, you could type in your correct answers in a different colour so your teacher can see your self-correction when you hand your work in, or you could use the drawing tool to mark and write corrections if you prefer. So moving on to animal and plant cells, you can see a couple of pictures here of animal cells and plant cells under a microscope. We've done this before. This is very much revision, so you have a task to do now. In your notebook, you'll see that you've got a table which is reminding you of the different functions of the organelles or cell structures. You've got diagrams of animal and plant cells with some sort of label boxes for you to write in or type in. You're going to complete those. I've done the nucleus as an example for you. So do as much of this as you can from memory to start with, okay? And then once you've done as much as you can, use the table of information to go back and look at your work, check your answers, fill in any gaps, make corrections as needed. So pause the video now and go on with that task. Okay, we're going to look at diffusion and osmosis now. Diffusion and osmosis are the ways that substances move into and out of animal and plant cells. So the sorts of substances animals and plant cells need to absorb or release are things like oxygen, glucose, carbon dioxide, which is a waste product in animal cells but is used by plants for photosynthesis. And animals also need to get rid of a waste product called urea. You've got all this information in your notebook. Water being the last one. Excuse me. So diffusion is a way that particles move in and out of cells across a semi-permeable membrane. So you'll recall, I hope, that the cell membrane controls what goes in and out of a cell. We say it's semi-permeable, which means it allows some substances to move in and out, but not others. So the cell membrane's got tiny little holes in it, and those holes are big enough to allow very small molecules through, such as water, but not large molecules such as starch. So in our diagram, the cell on the left, the cell is obviously the yellow part. The cell on the left has got a low concentration of our blue molecules compared to the fluid outside of the cell where there's a very high concentration. And on the right, you can see that over time the particles move from the high concentration outside the cell to the low concentration inside the cell until we reach an equal concentration, and we call that equilibrium. It's important to remember that diffusion is passive, and that means it doesn't require energy. You'll recall these particles are all in solution, so they're moving randomly all the time, and that difference in concentration combined with that random movement, results in an overall movement of particles, in this example, into the cell. You've now got some review questions to answer in your notebook, so use the information on your notebook to help you. Pause the video while you complete these and then I'll give you the answers. So the answers now. Diffusion is movement of a substance from a high concentration to a low concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. Of course, it doesn't matter if you haven't said it in exactly those words. Number two, semi-permeable means that it allows some molecules to pass through but not others. You may have said it allows small molecules but not large, that's fine. And number three, passive means it doesn't require energy. It just happens naturally due to the random movement of particles. Okay, we're going to move on to osmosis now. So you'll notice this diagram is very similar to the diffusion one I showed you just now. The difference is that osmosis is diffusion of water. So whenever we talk about osmosis, we're talking about water particles moving from an area of high diffusion to an area of an area of high concentration of water to an area of low concentration of water. So looking at the diagrams now, if we interpret the diagrams as the blue particles being water, then we can see that in the cell on the left, we've got a very high concentration of water outside of the cell and a very low concentration of water inside the cell. And over time, the water particles diffuse from the area of high concentration outside the cell to the area of low inside the cell. And that will keep happening until we've got overall an even concentration of water in the tissue fluid outside of the cell and the fluid on the inside of the cell in the cytoplasm. So osmosis, like diffusion, is passive. It's basically diffusion of water. Okay, so you've got a couple of questions to answer now. Pause the video, answer the questions, and I'll give you the answers. The questions are, if the particles in the diagram are water, which cell would we say is surrounded by a hypertonic solution? And how do you know? And in osmosis, does water move from a hypotonic solution to a hypertonic solution or the other way around? So pause and answer those now. So the answers. Question 1, cell A is in a hypertonic solution. And we know that because the concentration of water in the solution outside of the cell is higher than in the cell. And number 2, water moves from hypertonic to hypertonic because it moves from a high to a low concentration of water. Now we're moving on to active transport. There are occasions when organisms need to move particles from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So they're going up the concentration gradient. So an example of this in animals and in humans is that we have glucose in our blood. But sometimes, even when we've got glucose in our blood already, we want to absorb more of it from our intestines. We might have a very low concentration of glucose in our intestines, but still we want to move that glucose into the blood. Another example would be plants absorbing minerals from soil. They may well already have minerals in their roots, and there may be very low levels of minerals in the soil, but they will try and move what's left in the soil up the concentration gradient into the root. Now, this process can't happen automatically. random movement of particles moves particles from high to low concentration, not the other way around. And so this process needs energy because it's moving particles up the concentration gradient, and so it's known as active transport. Okay, active transport means energy is being used. Again, you have review questions to answer. So question 1, in terms of concentration gradient, how is active transport different to diffusion and osmosis? And 2, why can active transport not be described as a passive process? Pause the video and answer those, and then come back for the answers. Okay, so number 1, the molecules move from low to high concentration, not high to low, so that's the difference between active transport and diffusion or osmosis. And number 2, it can't be considered passive because it requires energy to move the molecules. A passive process is one that happens without energy. Okay, we're moving on to your last task now. In your notebook, you have 2 practice questions to have a go at. Okay, you've got answer boxes that you can fill in. This is the first question. This is the second question. And the higher element to these questions is that when you are answering them, if you want to extend yourself, you will try and use the terms hyper and hypertonic in your explanations. So have a go at answering those. Once you've finished, hand your work in so that your teacher can mark it. Thank you.